We'll start with our conversation with a topic which was not discussed earlier, and that is a part of the country partnership framework. And that topic relates to energy and climate. So, I'll ask Kamran Saab as to what his thoughts in general are about the energy transition and the climate change challenge that the Pakistan faces, and how would he actually suggest moving forward, and what is going to be the role of the private sector in handling and these massive challenges?
We look at in terms of the good thing about Pakistan is that we are much better in terms of the renewable energy contribution into our energy mix. We are close to 60% because of the hydro and everything. I think over the last 20 years, we see a lot of these things now becoming very, very evident. The climate change conversation has been happening since the late 70s and the early 80s, and a lot of warning signs were there. So just for the record, last year, 2024 was the hottest year in 200 years. And that's quite alarming. And now we have breached 1.5 degrees Celsius, and 2 degrees Celsius is going to be breached, which is pretty much a doomsday scenario. We see some of those things that we have recently seen in the people who have lived in Islamabad. Someone like me, there was no rain in 3 months, and now there has been rain, and the events have become a lot more acute. So you will see urban flooding, you will see droughts, and this year has been a drought kind of a situation in agriculture as well. I think Pakistan as a country has, although we have in the energy mix a larger contribution, but given that some positives which I think about is, if you are a lagging country, you also have the opportunity to leapfrog. So we were not part of any of the solar revolution in the earlier part of 21st century, but over the last 2 years, Pakistan has been the story of the renewables as well. That Pakistan has had the largest installation of solar, rooftop solar, on the grid and off the grid. Then number two, now we are seeing the EV revolution happening, unfold in the world. It started in 2010 when GM and Nissan started it. So it's not the Chinese companies that have done it. So the last 20 years, a lot of those things have become affordable for a country like Pakistan, and we stand to benefit because if we look at it in the transport sector, we are oil import dependent country, and the more ICE vehicles we have, it's actually contributing to our energy import bill, which is about 30 to 40% goes into transport. Even if we are able to reduce by 10% or 20%, it's a significant amount. It could be $1 billion out of $8 billion. So that is also there. Lastly, I think there is, with all this, the battery storage has become a lot more affordable now. So we will see that intermittency, Pakistan has a lot of potential in solar and wind. They were very costly in the earlier part of the century. The EV revolution is happening. It's now a lot more affordable in Pakistan. In a country like Pakistan, you can buy an ICE vehicle or an EV at the same price. The battery is going to become a lot more affordable, which is going to end the intermittency or reduce the intermittency for these renewable energy. I think lastly, what I would say is the only thing that we can expect the government to stay out of the business of doing anything. If they want to do anything with this sector, the renewable energy, the energy transition, I can tell you we are up for a disaster, because one thing that we do bad is planning. So today, the energy crisis that you see is missteps of 10 years ago, that we did not know how to plan the generation. Now we have excess generation. Today, we have a crisis of demand on the grid, and nobody talks about it. Really, the people are reneging the grid because it has become a lot more affordable for a household, for an industry to actually use their energy solutions. So I think private sector has a large role to play if there's no government mandated policy enforcement. Like, we don't need 600 megawatt or 2000 megawatts of solar backed by the government. We do need a policy, we do need facilitation, but I think that these elements which are there will allow us to transition to the energy sector. We have to focus on providing affordable energy and think about how do we encourage demand to mop up this excess generation? And the solution is in industrialization. We cannot have consumers consume in the non-productive loads this energy. And I think these are some of the things that we have all the right ingredients to benefit from this energy transition movement, which is happening globally. And there is an imperative of the climate change that we can benefit from. And there is a lot of financing available for the energy transition.
Constraint that we are facing currently in the power sector is a transmission constraint. We have a lot of cheap electricity installed in the south, but we don't have enough transmission capacity to transfer that power to the load center, which is in the central and northern part of the country. So what would be your policy prescriptions to the government to sort of address these challenges, to enable the private sector to come in and resolve them?
So I think the first one is that, as I said, that the government has failed to reform the SOEs in the energy sector. We have a lot of, I think we have about 40 entities that if you count all 10 discos. So they have to get out of the distribution and the transmission business, just like they did in the, number one is that. Number two is this uniform tariff. I think it is creating this distortion where we are operating expensive electricity producing plants in the center in the name of the load center. The load center is where the economic activity has taken. So if you have a cheaper electricity in the south, there is no harm in making that available to the productive sectors of society, which is industry. And if there is an export-oriented industry, there's actually should be a framework to allow that to be harnessed, because we have already incurred the cost in terms of putting up these power plants. These are base load power plants. They're not going to increase import bill, because the central power plants are also run on an imported fuel. So the trade-off that people talk about is also not, I mean, if you are operating central power plants on RLNG and the south power plants will be on imported coal, they're not going to even increase your the emissions, so to speak, because they are already taken into your accounted for in your baseline. Number three, I think we really need to have a reset and reevaluation of this wheeling and this CTBCM, which is a competitive market. It's a great thing, deregulation, I think, but our troubles are stabilizing the system. What we keep hearing about is that we will allow wheeling and industry will be able to get affordable and cheap power, but what we don't realize is that it will increase the burden onto those consumers who might not be the best paying consumers as well. If you're going to take out the best consumers out of the system and the producer are going to have a bilateral arrangement with them, what you're left with is the sector that you have failed to reform. The line losses are high in the low income areas, in those urban sprawls, and you have not done anything to fix that. So you will be aggravating this problem, as we have seen over the last 2 years, that the grid demand has reduced by 10%. The people who have found a solution are the people who can afford the solar, or the industries who've put the solar, or now they are going towards the battery. So you are already losing the good customer, and that is, as it is called, good sent out, like people in defense or DHAs of the country, people in the industrial areas, they have actually found the self-sufficiency solution. So if you want to solve this problem of excess generation capacity in the south, you have to make it affordable on a marginal price basis, because even if you were to put a transmission line from south to north, you will still need industry, you will still need productive load to consume it. And I don't see industrialization happening in those areas as well, that we wait for 3 years for this transmission constraint to be solved.
Thank you, Kamran Sahab. Dr. Farhat, if I could come to you, there's a question which has been asked by Mr. Abdurrahman Buraj, who also sits on the panel. You made an excellent presentation about the current situation of the healthcare sector in Pakistan and the amazing work that AQ has been doing in the country. So what should be the government's strategy to improve the overall healthcare system to address the issues that we are facing, given the current resource base available to the government, and how to bring in the private sector to supplement those resources?
Can I be heard? Yeah, I think. Thank you for that question. Uh, there are 3 or 4 fundamental points I would like to address. One, and I think when the World Bank conducted the so-called economic impact study, which Aga Khan organized way back, and this was an independent group of experts and consultants coming from your part of the world, the most surprising finding which we had was the, the benefit, economic benefit and impact which a health or educational institution can have on the country's economy. Generally, if you go to policymakers, you go to those who put the budgets, the mindset is what? If you have to generate revenue, essentially what you have to do is invest in for-profit and industry and various other sectors. And if you go towards health and education, these are consumptions. You always have a drain. And so I'm challenging the tenet, and I'm really addressing the audience to study that, because you will be surprised that if you start investing in health and educational institutions in the country, the direct benefit and the spin-offs which happen will benefit the economy of the country as much as other industry which you essentially do for that purpose. So this is a broad statement which I wanted here. And I think this is very extremely crucial that this is better studied. It is better studied, very well studied in the Western world, and I think perhaps you all can organize a symposium essentially looking at the relationship of how the economy, the other so-called sectors which always conventionally are thought that would not give a positive input in terms of economic generation within the country. I think health and educational sector, you'll be surprised. So you create colleges, you create schools, you create universities, you create these kind of organizations, and you'll be surprised in the longer run what will start happening to the economy. And I think there are tons of reasons. We will not go into the detail of that. Number two, I think, unfortunately, and I think that I didn't show that slide, देखिए, health and education, they're not cheap. If you really want to do quality health, quality education, it requires investment. Government spending, if you have 1.2% of your GDP as overall budget going into it, and you expect, world-class results, that's a wrong expectation. 60 to 70% of the contributions are coming from private sector, is continuing to grow, but the worrisome thing is the out-of-pocket expense. In our organization, when we studied, we found that people who come to us, you'll be surprised, 80 to 85% are paying out of the pocket. There's no insurance coverage, there's third-party payments are not there. There is a lot of work which is being done in the public sector and in the private sector, particularly in philanthropic sector, where people are developing institutes of excellence through social and civil society contributions. One example, obviously, is the wonderful Citizen Foundation work in education. And similarly, in health, you see all of that. But these are, I would say, these are all supportive things. The private sector in health and education can only support the government. It is primarily the government responsibility to lay down foundation, bring in partnerships, and essentially enroll as many people as who can to supplement that. So primarily, I think, first of all, the amount of budget allocations toward health and education have to go up. Second thing, whatever budget is allocated, I think the so-called slippages, which we see, those slippages, how you can control the slippages and actual utilization of the funds. I think that's, those are big issues, and transparency, accountability, the right kind of governance model, public-private partnerships which need to be created. So there is no easy solution, there's no easy answer, but I would say that, you have to invest more, you have to engage the other sectors, particularly the public sector, the private sector, because that's really your anchor of the health in this country. If you account for the slippages which happen, you will find that 80+% of the entire healthcare in the country is provided by private sector across the country. A lot of philanthropic organizations. Now, government really has to upstake their contribution and also has to control slippages and work with private organizations to really create a system. And I think what I was trying to talk about earlier of universal health coverage, essential health services, if you really provide, and that we have seen in Gilgit-Baltistan over the last 20, 30 years. You invest in basic essential health and primary education, engage the communities, and the overall outcomes are dramatically changed. And these are internationally monitored, globally reported figures which you see, and that's what you're interested in, because our indicators are so dismal at this moment, and they require a holistic contribution of both public and private sector and policymakers to transform it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, sir. Just a follow-up question. If, for example, any provincial government or the federal government asks for your support, your organization's support to step in and take over maybe some of the hospitals in the public sector, is that something that which can be looked at by your organization, or that's something that you would typically not do?
I would say that, we've been ever since the inception extremely closely working with both federal and provincial government. We work with multilateral, bilateral. We have large number of support agencies. We have provided support in almost every major fora in both health and education. And we are into all kind of, various committees and things. We provide that. As far as management of our running facility, that's something we have not done, and for various reasons. Because you can only manage a facility where you have full control, and that becomes very challenging. Really taking over and trying to manage, whereas and that has happened not only in public sector but also in other kind of affiliations which we were requested to develop. That's very difficult.
Okay, thank you very much. Baraisa, if I could come to you, you've worked on both sides of the table actually. You've been in the private sector, you've worked in the government sector as well. So given the challenges that we are facing and the kind of nature of challenges that we're facing, the investment which is required in human capital, energy, climate change, infrastructure, what do you think are the structures and vehicles which can be used to channelize more private resources to ensure that, the desired objectives set out by the government and the World Bank are achieved, or at least some progress is made towards achieving those objectives?
Asif, I would say as a rule, government should not provide any goods or services that the private sector can provide in a competitive manner at a reasonable cost. So what are the goods and services that the government should be providing? In my opinion, there are two types, broad types. One are public goods, which is mostly infrastructure like roads and rails and water supply and all those kinds of infrastructure, which the private sector would probably not provide at all because there is no clear market for that. So infrastructure provision is primarily the government's responsibility, and public-private partnerships have proven that many of these infrastructure facilities can be provided better in partnership with the private sector. I think Pakistan has experimented mainly in two sectors. One is roads, where private sector has come and built and maintained the roads, and the government has provided certain concessions by allowing them to charge user fees for use of those roads. And the other big experiment, I think, has been in the electricity sector. Due to the recent late payments and accumulation of overdues by the government have created a bad taste, but I think If we evaluate it over the last 20 or 30 years, the system has worked well also in many ways. It has ensured considerable increase in the generation capacity of the government. So I think infrastructure, we already know what to do. I think other types of infrastructure should also be designed on the public-private partnership strategy. The private sector should be allowed to bring in their money, do the construction. In certain cases, government can provide land. In certain cases, the government can provide certain minimum guarantees for usage of that infrastructure. The government can provide certain guarantees to protect the investors against expropriation of assets or major changes in taxation policies. So the government can indirectly ensure that the private sector is able to utilize its capital and its expertise smoothly and without unnecessary facing unnecessary issues. I think the fundamental principle in public-private partnership is that risk should be borne by the party which is best able to bear it. So typically, private sector has more capital and more expertise to build and to maintain a facility. Government typically can provide assurance against regulatory risks. The regulations should not change too frequently. The taxes should not increase abruptly. If the private sector has made some very long-term investments in certain cases, competing infrastructure, important category of goods and services, which today's seminar has highlighted, is merit goods, which come mainly in the form of education and healthcare. What I mean by merit goods is that although private sector will provide education and healthcare, but the supply of these services will probably always fall short. Not because demand is low for these services, but because of supply side factors. Sometimes costs are too high, sometimes the relevant expertise or capacities are not available. So the government has to come in and remove all those supply side problems. It has to reduce the cost of providing these services. If it can provide land, if it can provide some tax concessions, in certain cases outright subsidies, the government should do everything to ensure that the supply of quality education and healthcare increases. And it's heartening to know that the government has realized that Citizen Foundation can be a great partner in the education sector. I keep wondering why government has not already partnered with institutions like Aga Khan Hospital to advise the government how to implement this model in the healthcare sector also. We keep hearing that Punjab government has tried to outsource certain healthcare facilities also. I'm not sure how much data is available on how well those healthcare facilities are performing, but it would be great to know more about that. But I personally think this is the way to go. The healthcare and education services should be provided mostly by the private sector, and the government has to remove the supply side bottlenecks. One important challenge that the government would face would be to measure the outputs or outcomes that these educational or healthcare facilities provide. I think organizations like TCF and AKU are able in advising the government set the measurement and quality assurance standards. Thank you.
Okay. Raisa, you probably wanted to ask a few questions to Mr. Amir as well. So I would appreciate if you can ask those questions directly rather than, I read
Thank
them
you,
out.
Asif. One key question that I have for both of our experts, the healthcare expert and the education expert, is to kindly tell us a little bit more about the business models of your organization. How does your organization survive financially? To what extent it generates the resources itself through its operations? To what extent it relies on grants or subsidies or some other form of support? So that we can understand better that if these models are to be upscaled and the government is to come in and say that yes, we are ready to facilitate, as Dr. Saab said, we are ready to allocate more budget, what exactly are we expecting from the government from a facility like the ones that TCF and AKUH are running?
I'm not sure if the mic is, yeah, it's working. Great question, sir. Um, So I may not be the best person to answer, but the little I know, I'll try to respond. So the Aachen University I'll talk about, not about the network, because that's not under my purview or I'm not affiliated with directly. But the university is not for profit. We have 9 or 10 major constituencies, which is essentially operational in 6 different countries now. So we have 2 medical colleges, 2 schools of nursing, 2 Institute of Educational Development, Institute of Study of Muslim Civilization in London, and then examination board and many other components. Now, university is now operational for over 40 years. Ever since inception, I think the capital investment has primarily been by His Highness, the Chancellor, who provided, I think mid-2000, we started seeing contribution coming from mainstream donors outside the community, and that's generally growing. But those are mostly in patient welfare and to support education. The donor funding towards capital projects, such as if we do any major building, any major project, and so on and so forth. And, so we have built something like a Center of Innovation in Medical Education, which is using technology to teach medical education intervention for students and both medical and nursing. It's a $20 million project which was done way back about 15 years ago. And that was through major donors, 4 major donors who contributed to that. Now, a couple of things. We do not get any government funding, number one. We get a lot of funding for research projects and other projects through multilateral, bilateral. We have relied on low-cost investments and primarily using international agencies. And we are now exploring low-cost financing if it becomes feasible and available from our local Pakistani financial institutions as well, because we have a major expansion plan. To tell you all the entities which are outside health system, they all, for the last 40 years, they have a deficit budget each year. So one question which I've been the dean of the medical school for 12 years, and one question always people used to ask me, how can we create a medical college? Please tell us. And because medical colleges in Pakistan make a lot of money, I said, I don't know about the others, but we have always had a deficit budget because to run a quality education. And so everything, sir, to answer your question, how we run our business, so every single entity besides health services has a deficit budget which need to be plugged in. Health services develop, they generally create both in Pakistan and in East Africa surplus, which is usually a single digit, which is not enough to balance the entire budget for the entire organization, the university. The support which we always get is from our endowment funding, which was initially created by the Chancellor. We always get funding from the Chancellor, and we always get a lot of donations coming to us from various sectors. I'll just explain very simply about the patient welfare and student welfare. So last year, our disbursement was about 7 billion PKR, about $28, $29 million. And in that, we get in 2 heads. One is welfare funding, and second is zakat funding. Welfare zakat ratio is about 10:1, so about 10 times welfare as opposed to 1 time zakat. That's the size of the collection we get. And outside donations which we get from everywhere is about 20% of the total funding. So it used to be 70, this year is ballooned up to 80. So 80% of the total disbursement actually we do out of our own funds and out of our own cash flows. So to tell you about 7 to 8% of the revenue which we get in health services, I'm talking gross, that is sidelined and siphoned towards patient welfare, which is about 7 to 8%. That's a significant chunk. To answer your question, I think whatever surplus we get in health services helps towards managing the budget of the academic entities, which always have a deficit budget, and the little if we have any surplus, we reinvest towards our various other initiatives which we want to do. Now I'll tell you, just to give you some sense that going forward, next 4 or 5 years, we have significant expansion plan for health services in Pakistan. And the quantum which I'm roughly looking at is $400 million. It's a lot of money. That amount of money, we will be absolutely looking at 5 or 6 different funding streams to, if we can find it, which will help us towards expansion program. I hope that kind of answers your question. Thank you.
There was one particular mantra that I wanted to mention in my presentation which slipped my mind, and that's something to do with, starts with real estate. I'm sure some of you deal with real estate, or most of us do in some way or the other. And the main thing in real estate is location, location, location. The worth of a property, one always says, is location, location, location. And that mantra I extend in my head, what is the worth of a country? And it's always education, education, and education, really, at the end of the day, and that sort of applies across the board. Having said that, education, as Commissioner Saab and as we all know, is being guaranteed in the Constitution to be provided by the government. Unfortunately, despite that constitutional requirement, there's, as I mentioned, 26 million children out of school, even as of today. And as the Prime Minister himself said, it's an education emergency. Nothing short of a crisis. What are we looking at going forward? So, having set the tone, we're doing, as I mentioned, 300,000 students, which is just about 1%, a drop in the ocean. But as I mentioned to somebody, of course, it's always a case of katra katra darya banta hai. And we try and do, we live in Pakistan. We are going to, hopefully, for myself at least, I can speak, die here as well. So we have to do whatever best we can within our sphere of influence. So the other point that my friend mentioned was educational and health expert. But I would like to qualify that by saying I'm not an education expert, something I mentioned at the outset of my presentation. I have a different background altogether, but it's just purely my interest and my passion in this field that attracts me to it, and which has been something very close to my heart. In the last 4 years, I have never felt as contented or as thankful to God for providing me this opportunity. Now with that background, how does it all work? The government has to give education, it can't. So we come in as a private institution and we say, fine, let's see what we can do with it. The start is very noble. We've got these 5 well-meaning citizens who come together, they pool in their money, they set up the school, and then gradually it expands, expands. And as it expands, of course, the needs grow. So on the one hand, there is the expense. The other hand, of course, is the funding. Now, whether TCF was able to create an organization that build up that trust and confidence in people to give money for a cause for which there is no immediate reward. The reward, as I mentioned, is long-term, and the benefit, as we all know, is long-term. So it's always much more difficult to convince donors to give to this cause versus, say, for example, health. Health ke andar, haan ji, cancer ho gaya, ye ho gaya, wo ho gaya, and you will get an outpouring of grief and people will give money readily. But for education, it's always, but the long-term impact and the number of people impacted is exponential. So therefore, we reached out both within the Pakistani community here and, just as importantly, the global community of Pakistan. So we have three sources of funding primarily. The main one is the donations that come in, the donations and the zakat. The second one is parental contributions. Now, parental contributions is something that is taken very seriously by both our board and our management, because we feel that parents who are even earning, say, 15,000, 20,000 rupees a month should have a skin in the game. Even if they can afford to give 10 rupees, they should give 10 rupees to a child so that they know that their hard-earned money is being taken very seriously. And it does give, but again, it's not the primary source, as I mentioned earlier, is donations. Then, of course, there's investments, etc., that we make. The fourth one is government contribution, and something that Commissioner Saab spoke about is the government-public-private partnership. We in TCF feel that because of the scale of the problem, we do not have the capacity, of course, to take it on the scale that is needed. 26 million children, as opposed to 300,000 we have. So it's only the government that has that sort of ability. But the question and the conundrum here is there the will? And as Dr. Saab said, the money. Both health and education have been woefully underfunded throughout the years. And it's not something that developed woefully underfunded throughout the years. And it's not something that developed suddenly. It's been, unfortunately, a case of misplaced priorities for any government that's been in power in Pakistan. So, yes, we do cooperate very closely with the government. And just to give you an example, this recent program that I talked about, the PSRP, or the Public Sector Reorganization Program that the government of Punjab is doing and getting into government private partnership. There are 14,000 schools that the government will enter into on that basis, of which they've already done 3,000, 5,000 the next stage, and the remaining in the third stage. We were negotiating with them on how much should the government give us per child. And the ones that we were doing previously under the previous program with the government of Punjab, which was PSSP, which was done back in 2016, we were getting 800 rupees a child. And our cost as of date was nearly 2,500 rupees per child. So there was a deficit of 1,700 that we had to make up from donations and from other sources that we get. So we told the government, look, we are in 2024 now, which is last year, of course, and our cost is 2,500 rupees. So give us something which is reasonable and which sort of, goes towards, if not meeting the entire cost, part of the cost. The government ultimately came up with a figure of about literally 1,560 rupees, and there was another 300 rupees for, additional facilities that the schools may be provided, that the organizations may provide the schools. This is despite the fact that had the government continued to run the schools, it would have cost them, and they were costing them, over 4,000 to 5,000 rupees per child. So for us even to ask us for reimbursement of our full cost from the government was not too far-fetched. Yet they said, all right, we'll give you this 1,500 rupees, take it or leave it. So we said, in the bigger scheme of things, what are we looking at? We are there for the children, all right? So we will take them no matter when. We took them, and we are managing them, but we are running at a deficit for the schools, for the public-private partnership schools. We are going to increase the quantum. As I mentioned, we're going to take on 500 new schools coming in this year. We've already got 270 in Punjab. We've got 400 in Sindh. So that's a large number. The Sindh government has been slightly more generous, but yet much below our per child costs. So overall, um, the funding by Allah ke fazl say, because of the overseas diaspora of Pakistanis, we have PCF USA, we have PCF Canada, we have PCF UK, we are now establishing one across Europe, opening one in Australia. So about 65% of our total donation funding comes in from abroad. So this is the Pakistani diaspora abroad. And mashallah, it is increasing, it is sustainable, as long as Mr. Trump tomorrow doesn't decide, just like they did with USA, to cut down, वो source हमारे लिए रहेगा दूसरे areas. And then of course within Pakistan as well. So 35 to 40% comes from Pakistan.
Thank you.
So
Thank you, Amir Saab.
Sorry.
Sorry, in the interest of time, just going to ask one final question to
Ji, ji.
Goman Saab, who's sitting in for Mr. Naji. What can be done to actually raise the level of awareness about these critical issues and to start having more meaningful conversation about the challenges we are facing with respect to human capital? Because like Naji said himself, that most of the conversation is about GDP growth, inflation, excellent accounts, stuff like that, and nobody's talking about the human capital scorecard where we are really showing appalling indicators.
Thank you, Asif. I'll try to be brief. I think to move the conversation from where it is right now, few things have to change. And they are both how we look at the financing of this thing, whole agenda, and also how the public views these essential services coming from the public sector. I think one thing which has been acknowledged by the panel is that both health and education do not receive enough allocation. But I think the problem is much more severe than that. So going back in time, 2010, we've had the devolution in Pakistan. But out of that devolution, what has been achieved? Public service delivery function has gone to provinces, primarily health and salary in Pakistan, and a public schools teacher in Pakistan. Of course, the comparison would show that public school teacher gets paid very well compared to the market. Similarly, the perks and benefits in terms of pensions, post-retirement benefits are quite substantive. But has this conversation linked to any outcomes? So the point basically I'm trying to make is that to ask for more endowment, you need public trust. And public trust will only come when there are outcomes. And those outcomes are at the levels which are being discussed: primary healthcare, basic education. And I think this is both a challenge of financing as well as the governance model that we have in Pakistan, which is a devolution which is stuck at the second tier of the government. So to have more endowments, we need more outcomes. To have more outcomes, I think the governance model has to change. The current hybrid system that we have in Pakistan, where we have secretarial support coming from health and education, is not taking the cognizance of the disparities that exist in Pakistan. For example, we are sitting in Sindh. We did a public expenditure review for Sindh prior to COVID, and we saw this amazing statistics that there is no match between the learning outcomes and the resources. So the resources are where the learning outcomes are actually okay, and where the learning outcomes are actually pretty poor, we don't have resources. And similarly, there is a mismatch between the resources as well. So for example, schools are somewhere, teachers are somewhere else. And again, governments do not have a good tab on the payroll, on the governance issues. In Sindh, for example, when the government tried to enforce teacher presence, what did it lead to? It led to an exodus, leading to increase in pension bill of the government. So I think all of this conversation comes back to two things. You need more financing, you need taxpayers' interest. This is something which cannot be financed out of a World Bank loan or out of international support or out of benevolence. I think for this you need tax collection. For taxpayers, kind of like trust that system is working. For that trust to come in, the core governance issues have to be resolved until unless there is a functional governance model in Pakistan which talks about complete devolution in terms of particularly these basic services. This will be a big challenge. So, and I can talk around and around. Sindh has a private sector kind of like arrangement where they are using private sector partners to provide healthcare services, especially private healthcare services. I mean, the data has to come back to us and tell us that private basic healthcare outcomes, have they improved in Sindh or not? And it's not to like go into political conversation. I'm just mentioning Sindh's example because we are sitting in Karachi. Same would be the case in Punjab as well. What has happened to these public-private partnerships? Are they doing any better compared to government schools? I think the general evidence is not. So I think there is something very foundational to the governance model. There is enough global evidence that unless there is a community ownership of these initiatives, it doesn't really work. And then at the end of the day, just taking one more moment, at the budgeting level, it's a challenge that I think as a economy, as a society, we all have to go through this transition, that if there is a priority for something, that priority should be contested. Even in the intro that Vadai Saab made, you could clearly see a bias towards infrastructure. And we have invested very heavily in infrastructure, okay? And public sector has done this on behalf of taxpayers. So I think our mindset has to fundamentally change about these things, and that conversation is something which is very central to changing the governance model of Pakistan, and this will take some time.
Okay. With that, I'd like to thank all our esteemed panelists for taking the time to share their thoughts on these important topics with us today. I'd also like to thank all the participants for taking the time to come here this morning and to listen to their presentations and to this panel discussion. With that, I'd like to now request our Executive Director to please kindly come on the stage to hand out the mementos to our speakers and panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. May I request a big round of applause for our panelists, and I would also like to acknowledge the architect of this seminar, Mr. Asif Ali Qureshi, who's the director of CFSIT, and thank you to all of the speakers. And may I now request the panelists to please step up for a group photograph. May I request Muhammad Asim, the president of CFSIT Pakistan, to join us. May I also request Junaid Ahmed, who's also the director of CFSIT Pakistan, to please come on the stage. Junaid, thank you. Is there a place for... May I now request the President Muhammad Asim to please give this plaque to Mr. Adnan Ghuman. Adnan Sahab, thank you for all your support for this event and otherwise to the CFSIT Pakistan. Asim, wahan se aa raha hai. Asif sahab ko bhi bula lein. To Dr. Farhat Abbas, please. Dr. Farhat, your presentation is absolutely an inspiration for us. Mr. Ali Amr, please. Mr. Kamran Kamal, please. Mr. Abdul Rahman Varaij. And last but not the least, Mr. Asif Ali Qureshi. Thank you once again.